Little girl gives a secret signal to a royal guard in court. He stands up and slaps the judge. The little girl had never been inside a royal court before. She had seen pictures of such places in storybooks, with high ceilings, shining chandeliers, and walls decorated with portraits of people who seemed very important. But nothing in the books could prepare her for the real thing. As she stepped inside with her parents, she felt her small hands clutching theirs tightly, a mixture of excitement and nervousness swirling in her stomach. The air was heavy with the smell of polished wood and candle wax, and every step she took seemed to echo through the vast room. Guards in bright uniforms stood silently along the walls, their faces stern, their eyes scanning the crowd without missing a single movement. The courtroom was grander than she had imagined. Rows of benches stretched far back, filled with people who whispered quietly among themselves, some looking anxious, others confident. At the very front, on an elevated platform, sat the judge. He was older, with gray hair slicked back neatly and sharp eyes that seemed to notice everything. His robes were deep red with golden trimmings, signaling authority and power. The little girl watched him closely, trying to understand why grown-ups seemed both afraid and respectful in his presence. Her parents had brought her here for a reason. They had told her it was important to see how justice worked, how decisions were made in the highest courts, and how people sometimes had to fight for fairness. The girl listened carefully, nodding politely, but her mind wandered as she observed the small details that nobody else seemed to notice. She saw the faint trembling of some people who were standing to speak, the hesitant way they approached the judge, and the way others tried to avoid his gaze altogether. As the proceedings began, the girl's eyes caught something troubling. A man who had come to the court for a simple matter seemed to be treated unfairly. He spoke softly, explaining his side of the story, but the judge interrupted him constantly, dismissing his words with a wave of his hand. The girl felt a surge of concern. She did not fully understand the law, but she could tell that the man was being silenced unfairly. Her small heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to shout, to tell the judge to listen, but she knew that children were not allowed to speak in court. The little girl's gaze shifted to the royal guard standing nearby. He was tall and imposing, with a uniform that gleamed under the sunlight coming through the tall windows. His posture was perfect, his expression serious, but the girl sensed a kind of awareness in his eyes. It was as if he could see more than he let on, as if he understood things beyond the rules and orders he had been given. She studied him carefully, trying to find a way to communicate without words. Her mind worked quickly. She remembered how, in games with her friends, they used secret signals to share plans without anyone else knowing. Could she do something similar here? Could she warn the guard about the injustice she saw unfolding before her? She took a deep breath, steadying her nerves, and began to think of the tiniest, most subtle gestures. A blink here, a tilt of the head there, anything that might catch his attention without alerting the judge or the other officials. Meanwhile, the courtroom continued its proceedings. The judge's voice echoed across the chamber, firm and commanding. "You must follow the rules," he said, though it was clear that he was bending them to favor one side. The little girl's eyes narrowed as she watched the man struggle to speak, to make his point. She felt a mixture of anger and determination. She knew she had to do something, even if she did not know exactly what. She began with a small movement of her hand, brushing it against her cheek in a deliberate way. She held the guard's gaze for a moment, and he paused in his duties, his eyes meeting hers. There was a flicker of recognition, a silent understanding forming between them. She tried another signal, tilting her head slightly to the left, then right. Each gesture was calculated, precise, as if she were performing a dance only he could understand. As she continued, she noticed the guard's body language changing ever so slightly. His posture remained upright, but there was a tension in his shoulders, a quiet alertness that had not been there before. He had noticed her. He understood that she was trying to communicate something important. The little girl felt a mixture of relief and nervousness. This was bigger than any game she had played before. If she made a mistake, it could lead to trouble, but if she succeeded, perhaps justice could be served. The girl's attention also remained on the judge. He seemed more focused on maintaining control than on listening to the truth. He waved his hand dismissively at the man trying to speak, and the little girl's heart sank. She could see the frustration on the man's face, the fear of speaking against someone so powerful. It reminded her of stories she had heard about bravery, about standing up even when it was dangerous. She wanted to be brave, too. She thought of the lessons her parents had taught her. Observe carefully, think before acting, and trust those who are loyal and honorable. The guard was clearly one of those people. He followed orders, yes, but he was also someone who understood right from wrong. She could see it in his eyes. She decided she would continue sending signals, hoping he would act if the moment came. Time seemed to stretch in the courtroom. Every word from the judge felt heavier, every motion of the gavel louder. The little girl stayed alert, her eyes constantly shifting between the judge, the guard, and the man who was struggling to speak. She noticed the subtle reactions of the crowd as well. Some were leaning forward, curious. Others whispered nervously among themselves. She realized that many people were afraid to challenge the authority of the judge, but she had a different perspective. From her small vantage point, she could see the injustice clearly, and she felt a responsibility to do something about it. She decided to escalate her signals. She raised her hands slightly, fingers trembling just enough to catch the guard's attention. She blinked rapidly as if trying to send a message in a secret code. The guard's eyes narrowed and he leaned slightly forward as if ready to respond. The little girl's heart raced. She could not speak, but she could act in her own quiet way. Her courage grew with each passing second, even though fear still lingered at the edges of her mind. The man who had been silenced suddenly tried to speak again, but the judge interrupted harshly. The girl clenched her fists, wishing she could intervene. She realized that waiting any longer might allow the injustice to continue. She intensified her signals, tilting her head, moving her fingers, and locking eyes with the guard. He nodded ever so slightly, the smallest acknowledgement, but it was enough to reassure her that he understood. Around her, the courtroom remained tense. People shifted in their seats, sensing that something unusual was happening, though they could not see what. The little girl felt a strange mixture of fear, excitement, and determination. She knew that she had started something that could not be undone. She had chosen to act, even if it was only through subtle gestures. And the guard, sensing her urgency, was preparing to respond in the only way he could. The girl's mind wandered briefly to her family. Her parents were unaware of the secret communication happening between her and the guard. She hoped that they would understand if something unexpected occurred. She reminded herself to stay calm, to keep her signals precise, and to trust the guard's judgment. This was a moment of courage, a test of wit and bravery, and she was determined not to falter. As the session continued, the little girl noticed the judge growing more impatient, more dismissive. The man who had been silenced looked increasingly desperate. The little girl's resolve strengthened. She knew that silence could no longer serve justice. The guard, tall and steadfast, was watching her every movement, ready to act at the right moment. The little girl understood the gravity of the situation. One wrong move could cause chaos, but one clever move could change everything. She took a deep breath and steadied herself, ready to give the final signal. Her small hand moved in a deliberate pattern, her eyes locked on the guard, and in that silent moment, a powerful understanding passed between them. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath, the tension so thick it could be felt in every corner. She had set the stage, planted the seed of courage, and now it was up to the guard to act. Even as the judge continued to speak, unaware of the silent exchange happening before him, the little girl felt a strange calm. She had done everything she could within her power. The rest would depend on the bravery and wisdom of the guard, the one person in the room who could turn her subtle signals into action. She realized that courage could take many forms, not just words, but also quiet gestures, trust, and understanding. The courtroom, filled with whispers and watchful eyes, remained oblivious to the small but significant rebellion taking shape. The little girl remained alert, her mind racing with possibilities, her heart pounding with anticipation. She had learned something important that day. Even a child, small and seemingly powerless, could influence events in ways that mattered. She would never forget the sight of the guard, the judge, and the man struggling for fairness, all connected in that delicate, silent moment. The little girl's story was just beginning. She had sparked something remarkable, though she did not yet know how it would unfold. One small signal, carefully sent, had set in motion a series of events that could change the course of that courtroom forever. And as she watched and waited, she felt the thrill of anticipation, knowing that courage and cleverness could make even the smallest person a hero. The little girl's signals had not gone unnoticed. The royal guard, tall and disciplined, had felt a subtle change in the air. Something was different. He had seen the child's eyes lock with his, the small, deliberate movements of her hands and head. At first, he had thought it might be nothing, just a fidgety child trying to get attention. But the intensity in her gaze told him otherwise. There was a purpose behind every gesture, a hidden urgency that could not be ignored. The guard shifted slightly, his polished boots making no sound on the smooth floor. He tried to appear calm as if nothing were happening, but his mind raced. He had been trained to follow rules, to obey orders without question. Yet, deep down, he knew that sometimes rules could be bent for the sake of justice. He had seen unfairness before, but it was rare to see it so clearly, and rarer still to be called to act upon it in such a subtle, silent way. The little girl continued her signals, small but deliberate. She moved her fingers in patterns she had used with friends in secret games. She tilted her head and blinked her eyes rapidly, careful to remain subtle enough not to attract attention. She could feel her heart pounding faster with every passing second. The tension in the courtroom was growing, and so was the gravity of what she was attempting. One wrong movement could ruin everything. The guard's eyes followed each motion carefully. He was aware of the judge watching everyone, seeing nothing but his own power reflected in the faces before him. The man who had been silenced tried once again to speak, and the judge waved him off harshly, impatient and dismissive. The little girl's small chest tightened. She felt a strong desire to protect the man, to ensure that fairness was not completely forgotten in the grandeur and authority of the courtroom. The girl realized she needed to make her signals unmistakable, more urgent than before. She pressed her hands together, then slowly raised them in a manner that seemed natural but carried meaning. She shifted her body slightly to the left, as if stretching, then leaned back, locking her gaze on the guard each time. The guard's eyes narrowed. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down upon him, a weight heavier than any armor he had worn. He understood now that this was not a game. This was a call for courage, a test of whether he could act in a way he had never dared before. The courtroom seemed to close in around them. Every whisper from the spectators felt louder, every cough sharper. The judge's gavel struck with a rhythmic authority that seemed to echo through the walls and into the hearts of those present. The little girl's mind was sharp and focused, analyzing every possible outcome. What if the guard acted too soon? What if the judge reacted violently? Her chest ached with worry, but she could not stop now. She had to see her plan through, even though she did not know what form it would ultimately take. She noticed a small change in the guard's stance. He shifted slightly on his feet, one hand brushing the hilt of his sword, though he did not draw it. His other hand twitched ever so slightly, an unconscious reaction to the child's clear signal. He was aware of the risk. If he acted openly, the consequences could be severe, yet the little girl's courage was infectious. There was a sense of purpose in her eyes, a silent command that demanded he consider what was right rather than what was safe. The girl's signals became even more precise. She tapped her fingers lightly against her knee in a rhythmic pattern, a code she had made up in her mind just moments before. She leaned forward, then back, then raised one eyebrow, holding the guard's gaze all the while. Each movement was calculated, small enough to avoid notice but deliberate enough for the guard to understand. The connection between them was almost tangible. It was as if a silent thread had formed, linking their thoughts and intentions across the space of the courtroom. Meanwhile, the man who had been trying to speak became increasingly desperate. He shifted his weight, his voice trembling as he attempted to tell his side of the story. The judge, however, dismissed him again, growing more impatient and frustrated. The little girl's heart ached. She could see the fear in the man's eyes, the frustration of someone who had come seeking justice only to find barriers at every turn. She realized that she could not allow this to continue. She had to guide the guard to act, and she had to do it carefully without revealing their plan to the judge or the rest of the court. The tension between the girl and the guard grew, silent but intense. The guard's hand moved slightly, brushing against the edge of his belt, not to draw his weapon, but as a sign that he was preparing to act. His gaze was steady, unwavering, yet full of a quiet determination. The little girl felt a surge of hope. Perhaps her signals had worked. Perhaps he understood the urgency, the moral necessity of stepping forward when fairness demanded it. She remembered the stories her parents had told her about heroes, people who acted bravely when no one expected it, who stood for what was right even when the consequences were unknown. She realized that this was her moment to be a small part of something heroic. Even though she was just a child, her courage could inspire another person to take action. The guard, sensing her resolve, seemed ready to make the difficult choice. The girl also noticed subtle signs from the crowd. Some spectators were leaning forward, curious, sensing that something unusual was happening, though they could not understand what. Others whispered nervously, unsure of what to expect. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted subtly. The usual rigid order had been interrupted by something unspoken, a tension that no one could fully explain. And at the center of it all, the little girl remained focused, her mind sharp, her small body tense with anticipation. She prepared to give the final signal, one that would indicate clearly that the guard should act immediately. She straightened her posture, took a deep breath, and raised her hands slowly, a gesture that seemed casual but was charged with meaning. Her eyes locked with the guard's once more. This time she added a subtle flick of her fingers, a deliberate motion that could not be mistaken. The guard's eyes widened slightly, and a flicker of resolve passed over his face. He understood completely. The moment had arrived. As he prepared to move, the little girl's heart raced. She felt a strange mix of fear and excitement, knowing that the next moments could change everything. She could not speak, but her signals had conveyed her thoughts perfectly. The guard, tall and powerful, was now poised to act in a way that could alter the course of the courtroom. The tension in the air was nearly unbearable, each second stretching longer than the last. The man who had been silenced tried again to speak, his voice shaking, his hands trembling. The judge, noticing the subtle shift in the courtroom, frowned and looked around. He did not yet see what was about to unfold, but he sensed that control was slipping. The little girl remained calm, her eyes fixed on the guard, trusting him to act wisely and bravely. The guard shifted slightly, preparing to stand. His movements were deliberate, measured, and silent. He was aware of the eyes watching him, the potential consequences of his actions, but he was guided by the silent signal from the little girl. She had given him a choice, and he had chosen courage. In that moment, their silent communication had reached its peak. The little girl's careful planning, the guard's loyalty, and the need for justice had come together in a single, unspoken understanding. The girl felt a strange, calm wash over her. She had done everything she could. The guard was ready. The courtroom was on the edge of noticing, and the man who had been silenced was still unaware of what was about to happen. The little girl's signals had done their job perfectly, connecting two people across the formal distance of the court. And now, it was only a matter of moments before the consequences of their silent coordination would begin to unfold. Even as the judge prepared to continue his remarks, oblivious to the quiet tension in the room, the little girl remained alert. Her mind replayed each signal, each careful gesture, each silent plea for justice. She knew that the next action would change everything. It would be bold, unexpected, and potentially shocking. Yet she trusted the guard completely, confident that he understood her intent and would act in the right moment. The courtroom seemed frozen in anticipation, though the spectators were unaware of the silent drama unfolding before them. The little girl remained steady, her small frame tense with anticipation, her eyes locked on the guard. Every detail mattered, every gesture was crucial. The moment of action was near, and she knew that courage could come in many forms, even in the quiet, deliberate signals of a determined child. The guard's hand twitched slightly again, and the little girl held her breath. This was it, the moment when silent courage would meet action. The connection they had formed through subtle gestures and careful observation had brought them to this point. The little girl's signals had done their work, and the guard was now ready to act in the only way he could, guided by her cleverness and bravery. The moment had arrived. The little girl's heart pounded so hard it felt as if it might burst through her chest. She had given the guard every signal she could think of, every gesture meant to convey urgency, fairness, and courage. And now the guard, tall and unwavering, finally responded. Slowly, deliberately, he rose from his position. The polished armor of his uniform gleamed under the sunlight streaming through the windows, making him appear almost larger than life. Every eye in the courtroom turned toward him instantly. The crowd gasped. Whispers spread like wildfire through the benches, and the judge's sharp eyes flicked toward the movement. The guard did not hesitate or falter. He had made his choice, and nothing could sway him now. The little girl held her breath, her small hands gripping the edge of the bench. She knew what he intended to do, and she also knew that this moment would be remembered forever in the history of that court. The guard stepped forward, each movement controlled, precise, and filled with authority. His boots made a soft, echoing sound against the marble floor, commanding attention without words. The judge's frown deepened, sensing that something unprecedented was about to happen. The tension in the courtroom was nearly unbearable. People leaned forward, eyes wide, wondering what would happen next. The little girl's chest tightened with anticipation, but she remained perfectly still, her eyes locked on the guard. Then it happened. In a swift, decisive motion, the guard reached the front of the courtroom. The judge, still unaware of the full gravity of the situation, continued to speak in his commanding voice. And then, just as the man who had been silenced opened his mouth to speak, the guard raised his hand and struck the judge across the cheek. The sound echoed through the grand courtroom like a clap of thunder. Gasps erupted, and the crowd erupted into chaos. The little girl felt her stomach flip. She had seen this coming, she had planned for it, yet the reality was more intense than she had imagined. The judge's eyes widened in shock. He had never experienced such an act of defiance in all his years presiding over the court. Some spectators froze in disbelief, while others whispered hurriedly, trying to process the audacity of what had just happened. The courtroom, normally a place of strict order and decorum, seemed to erupt into a storm of emotions. The man who had been silenced could not believe his eyes. His fear, his frustration, his desperation, all of it melted into a mixture of awe and relief. Someone had finally acted on his behalf. Someone had challenged the injustice that he had endured. And it had been the guard, a man bound by duty and discipline who had taken a risk no one could have imagined. The little girl's eyes sparkled, a mix of pride and nervousness. Her subtle signals had worked. Her courage, small though it might have seemed, had guided the actions of a powerful man. The judge struggled to regain composure. He placed a hand to his cheek, shocked not only by the physical sting but also by the audacity of what had occurred in his courtroom. He looked around, trying to assess the situation, but the guard stood tall, unwavering, his gaze steady and firm. The message was clear. Injustice would not be tolerated, no matter the rules or traditions that seemed to protect those in power. The guard's actions did more than shock the courtroom, they inspired it. Some people were terrified, unsure of how to respond, while others admired the bravery it had taken to act. Whispers grew louder, spreading through the rows of spectators. The little girl could feel the energy in the room shift. What had been tense, quiet, and oppressive moments ago had transformed into an electric atmosphere filled with possibility. The truth, it seemed, could not be silenced. The guard's movements were deliberate, controlled, and dignified. He did not raise his voice. He did not shout. His single action spoke volumes. The slap was not a personal attack. It was a statement, a call for fairness and courage in a place where both were often overshadowed by authority and fear. The little girl felt her heart swell with admiration. She had always known that courage came in many forms, and now she saw it displayed so vividly before her. The judge attempted to speak, to reclaim authority, but the words faltered in his throat. He had never encountered such direct defiance, and the weight of the action pressed heavily upon him. His face betrayed a mix of shock, anger, and perhaps even a reluctant understanding. The courtroom was silent for a moment, everyone trying to process what had just occurred. And then murmurs began to ripple through the crowd. People whispered to one another, sharing astonishment, disbelief, and quiet admiration for the guard's courage. Meanwhile, the little girl could see that the man who had been silenced was finally finding his voice. Encouraged by the guard's bold act, he spoke clearly, confidently, and passionately. His words carried weight now, for the audience could sense the injustice he had endured and the courage it had taken for someone to stand up on his behalf. The little girl felt a warm pride in her chest. She had helped make this moment possible, even from her small place in the courtroom. The guard remained near the front, his posture tall and steady. He did not flaunt his action. He did not seek praise. He had acted out of principle, guided by a silent signal from a child who had recognized injustice when few others had. The little girl's admiration for him grew with every passing second. She realized that true bravery was not loud or showy. It was quiet, purposeful, and selfless. The judge, now fully aware of the implications, tried to regain control of the courtroom. His voice rose, commanding the attention of everyone present, but the authority he had wielded so effortlessly before now seemed fragile. The whispers of the crowd grew louder, a chorus of astonishment and quiet defiance that the judge could no longer ignore. Even the other guards shifted uncomfortably, sensing that the usual order had been disrupted in a way that could not easily be fixed. The little girl watched every detail. Her eyes moved from the guard to the judge, from the spectators to the man who had finally been given a voice. She felt a mixture of awe and nervousness, knowing that what had happened was extraordinary. Her signals had set in motion a chain of events that could never be erased. Courage, she realized, could come from anyone, whether a powerful guard or a small child observing quietly from the sidelines. As the courtroom settled into a tense quiet once more, the little girl reflected on what had just happened. The guard had acted boldly, guided by her silent signals, and justice had found a small victory. The man who had been silenced was now able to speak, and the judge, though stunned, could no longer ignore the truth. The little girl felt a sense of accomplishment, mixed with the thrill of witnessing something remarkable. The guard did not leave the front of the courtroom immediately. He remained near the man he had helped, ensuring that the proceedings could continue without further intimidation or injustice. His presence alone was a reminder that fairness could be defended, even in the most intimidating circumstances. The little girl admired his discipline, his courage, and his understanding of the subtle power of action guided by moral purpose. The spectators began to recover from their initial shock. Some were whispering in awe, others in disbelief, but all were aware that they had witnessed an extraordinary event. The little girl felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that her quick thinking and careful observation had played a role in making it happen. She understood now that courage and cleverness could work together to challenge injustice, even when the odds seemed overwhelming. The judge, finally regaining his voice, tried to address the courtroom, but his words were measured, cautious. He had learned in that moment that authority alone was not enough to command respect or silence the truth. The little girl felt a quiet smile form on her lips. The moment had been tense, dramatic, and dangerous, but it had also been a triumph of bravery, observation, and moral courage. The man who had been silenced continued to speak, now with confidence and clarity. The courtroom listened attentively, finally giving him the attention he deserved. The little girl's heart swelled with pride. She had not acted physically or loudly, but her presence, her signals, and her courage had guided someone else to take bold action. It was a lesson she would never forget. The guard returned to his position, standing tall and steady, but with a subtle sense of satisfaction. He had acted according to his principles, guided by the cleverness and bravery of a child. The little girl watched him, understanding for the first time that true courage often required partnership, trust, and the willingness to act when the moment demanded it. The courtroom had changed in those few minutes. The balance of authority, the flow of proceedings, and the perception of justice had all been altered. The little girl knew that she had been part of something extraordinary. She had witnessed bravery firsthand, guided it in her own quiet way, and seen justice begin to take its rightful course. As the session continued, the girl felt a sense of calm and pride. Her silent signals had led to an action that no one would soon forget. The guard had demonstrated courage, the man had found his voice, and even the judge had been reminded of the importance of fairness. And the little girl, small and seemingly powerless, had been at the center of it all. The courtroom was still buzzing with energy after the guard's bold action. The man who had been silenced finally had his chance to speak, and his words carried weight now that the injustice had been visibly challenged. The little girl, sitting quietly on the bench, watched him speak with a mixture of pride and relief. She had played her part silently, through subtle gestures and clever signals, and now she could see the effect of her courage unfolding. The guard had acted, the man had his voice, and the entire court had been reminded that fairness was more important than fear or tradition. The judge, still recovering from the shock, adjusted his robes and tried to regain control of the courtroom. His face was a mixture of anger, confusion, and reluctant respect. He could no longer ignore the guard's actions, and he could no longer dismiss the man's words so easily. The atmosphere had shifted. What had been a predictable, formal courtroom was now alive with tension, energy, and the quiet power of truth. The little girl sensed that things would never be exactly the same in this place again. The spectators whispered among themselves, some in disbelief and others in admiration. Many were impressed by the guards' bravery, though they were careful to remain discreet. Some glanced at the little girl, curious at the courage she must have possessed to inspire such action. She felt a strange mixture of pride and humility. She had not acted physically or spoken aloud, yet she had influenced events in a way that even grown adults could hardly imagine. The power of observation, cleverness, and courage had made all the difference. The guard returned to his post, but there was a subtle shift in the way he held himself. He was no longer just a silent observer of the law. He had become an active protector of justice, guided by a child's insight and bravery. He stood tall, his eyes occasionally flicking toward the little girl, a silent acknowledgement of the role she had played. The connection between them remained, a quiet bond formed in the heat of tension and moral courage. The man who had been silenced continued speaking, his voice now firm and steady. He described the events that had led him to the courtroom, the injustice he had faced, and the relief he felt at finally being heard. His words moved some in the audience to tears, and others to quiet nods of agreement. The little girl listened carefully, her heart swelling with emotion. She realized that even though she was small and often overlooked, her actions had empowered another person to reclaim their dignity and voice. As the proceedings continued, the judge seemed to soften. He listened more attentively, asked questions respectfully, and allowed the man to speak without interruption. Though the slap had been shocking, it had also served as a powerful reminder that authority must always be tempered with fairness and empathy. The little girl watched the transformation with quiet fascination. She had witnessed courage in many forms that day, the guard's decisive action, the man's newfound confidence, and even the subtle shift in the judge's behavior. Outside the courtroom, the story of the unusual events quickly spread. People whispered about the guard who had defied protocol, the little girl who had signaled him, and the man who finally found his voice. Though some spoke in hushed tones, fearful of the repercussions, others shared the story openly, praising the bravery and cleverness that had changed the course of that day. The little girl, of course, remained unnoticed by most, yet she understood that her quiet courage had been the spark for the entire sequence of events. In the days that followed, the courtroom atmosphere changed. Judges and officials began to reconsider how they treated those who came seeking justice. The presence of fairness and moral courage became more visible. The little girl's small act of clever observation and signaling had left a lasting impression, reminding everyone that even those who seemed powerless could influence outcomes in profound ways. Her courage became an invisible force, shaping the behavior of others without a word being spoken. The guard, too, gained a new sense of purpose. He was no longer merely a figure of authority. He had become a protector of fairness and justice, guided by wisdom, observation, and moral clarity. His actions were discreetly admired by colleagues and spectators alike, though few knew the full story of the signals that had prompted him to act. The little girl had been the invisible catalyst, a quiet observer whose courage had empowered someone else to take bold action. For the little girl, the events of that day became a defining memory. She realized that bravery was not always about physical strength or loud declarations. Sometimes, it was about observation, understanding, and knowing when to act in subtle but meaningful ways. She had learned that even the smallest person could influence events in a grand and lasting manner. The experience shaped her understanding of fairness, courage, and the responsibility that comes with awareness. Her parents, unaware of the silent signals she had sent, noticed only that she seemed unusually proud and confident after the session. They asked her what had happened, and she smiled quietly, saying only that she had observed carefully and learned much. They did not realize that she had been part of something extraordinary, something that had shifted the balance of authority and reminded everyone in that courtroom that fairness and courage were essential virtues. In the weeks that followed, the little girl often thought about the courtroom, the guard, and the man who had finally found his voice. She realized that her small act of courage had inspired more than one person. It had reminded the guard of the importance of moral action, empowered the man to speak his truth, and subtly influenced the judge to consider fairness more seriously. She understood that bravery and cleverness could have ripple effects, touching lives in ways that were sometimes invisible but always powerful. The courtroom itself became a quieter, more thoughtful place. Judges and spectators alike remembered the day when a guard had stood boldly, guided by a child's insight, to challenge injustice. The memory of the little girl's clever signals remained, even if few people knew the full story. Her bravery had created a legacy of moral courage, a reminder that even the smallest and youngest among us could influence events in profound ways. For the man who had been silenced, the events of that day became a turning point in his life. He spoke more confidently in public, became more involved in seeking justice for others, and often recounted the story of the day when fairness was defended so unexpectedly. Though he never mentioned the little girl directly, he often reflected on the mysterious and inspiring presence that had guided the guard's actions. The little girl, now carrying the quiet pride of her achievement, learned an important lesson about responsibility. Courage could take many forms, from the loud and dramatic to the quiet and subtle. Sometimes, it was not the person in the position of power who made the biggest difference, but the one who observed, understood, and acted with intelligence and care. She had discovered that even children could influence the world in meaningful ways. As the years went by, the story of that courtroom event was shared quietly among those who had witnessed it. The guard continued his service, respected not just for his authority, but for his moral courage. The man who had been silenced continued to speak out for fairness. And the little girl grew up with the knowledge that her observation, cleverness, and bravery had left a lasting mark on the lives of others. The lesson remained clear. Courage is not always about strength or power. Sometimes it is about seeing injustice, understanding the right moment, and acting, even in small, quiet ways, to make a difference. The little girl had acted with insight and bravery, inspiring someone else to take bold action. Together, they had reminded an entire courtroom that fairness, honesty, and moral courage were more important than tradition, fear, or authority. The memory of that day remained vivid in the little girl's mind. She would never forget the tension in the courtroom, the silent communication with the guard, and the moment of bravery that changed everything. She had learned that even in a world full of rules and authority, the power to influence events could come from careful observation, clever thinking, and the courage to act at the right moment. In the end, the little girl's story became a quiet legend. Though she did not seek recognition, her courage had inspired others and reminded everyone in the courtroom, and beyond, of the importance of fairness and moral action. The guard had acted bravely, the man had spoken his truth, and the judge had learned a lesson he would not soon forget. And all of it had started with a small, clever girl who had noticed an injustice, thought quickly, and used her intelligence to guide someone else to act boldly. The little girl smiled to herself, knowing that she had made a difference. She understood now that even the smallest actions could ripple out to create profound changes. And she knew that in the quiet moments when courage was needed most, she, and anyone else willing to act wisely and bravely, could influence the world in ways that mattered forever.